10. The Hamitic theory Seligman et al., which can be partly attributed to the proponents' ignorance of certain facts and partly to their desire to justify the colonial system, is the most racialist of these pseudo-scientific explanations. 11. N. Masatoshi and A. R. Roy Kudhuri, 1974, 26, 421. 12. J. Ruffy, 1977a, page 399. 267. Methodology and African Prehistory. 18 factors, for 27 populations extending from the Mediterranean region to south of the Sahara. 13. He obtained three main groups comprising four aggregates, one to the north, the Caucasoids, consisting of Europeans, the Reguiabat, the Saudi Arabs and the Kalkayummer Waregs, a southern aggregate consisting of the Negro groups of Oghaids, and intermediate aggregates including some Bororo, Fulani, the Air and Tassalite Waregs, the Ethiopians, and so on, but also the Hurritan, who are traditionally regarded as blacks. It would therefore be a mistake to take this subdivision as supporting the traditional classification into races, for quite apart from what has been said above, the general shape of the subdivision depends on the amount of data taken into account. If it is very small, the points M, A, Y, B all clustered together. As regards the MBN living south of the Sahara, it should be noted that the original name given them by Linnaeus was Homo AF for African. They were then called Negroes, and later still blacks, and sometimes a broader term Negroid was used to include all persons resembling the blacks who are found on the fringes of the continent or on other continents. Today, except for a few dissenting voices, the large majority of scholars agree on the basic genetic unity of peoples south of the Sahara. According to Boyd, the author of the Genetic Classification of Human Races, there exists only one Negroid group, which spreads over the whole of the sub-Saharan part of the continent, and is also found in Ethiopia, and it differs significantly from all the other major groupings. Research by Hiernes has yielded remarkably convincing evidence to support this proposition. Without denying that variations are apparent at local levels, he has produced the findings of an analysis of 50-50 distances between 101 populations to show the uniformity of the peoples of the sub-Saharan hyperspace, which embraces the Sudanese as well as the Bandit, the inhabitants of coastal regions and those of the Sahel, the Khoisan, Pygmies, Nilotic, Fulani and various minor groups such as those akin to the Ethiopians. On the other hand, he also shows the great genetic distance that separates Asian blacks from African blacks. Even in the field of linguistics, which has nothing to do with race but which has been used in racist theories to invent a language hierarchy reflecting the so-called racial hierarchy, with the pure Negroes on the bottom rung of the ladder, new systems of classification are shedding more and more light on the basic unity of African languages. Somatic variations can be explained scientifically by the causes of the changes discussed above. In particular, biotopes may give rise at one time to amalgamations of more composite populations Nile Valley and at other times to pockets of peoples which develop relatively atypical characteristics to be found in mountainous country, forests, marshlands, and so on. Lastly, history accounts for other anomalies which have resulted from invasions and migrations, particularly in outlying areas. The biological influence of the 13. A. Jacquard, 1974. 268. Theories on the races and history of Africa. Arabian Peninsula on the Horn of Africa is also evident in the peoples of that region, such as the Somalid, Galler and Ethiopians, but also, no doubt, in the Terek, Fulani, Tukular, Songhai, Hausa, and so on. I have seen marked upper Volta with very typically Semitic profiles. To sum up, the remarkable variety of African phenotypes is a sign that this continent has been evolving over a particularly long period. Such prehistoric fossil remains as are available indicate that the type found south of the Sahara settled over a very vast area stretching from South Africa as far as the northern part of the Sahara, the Sudan region having apparently been at the crossroads of these population movements. It is true that the history of Africa is not a history of races, but the pseudo-scientific myth of the superiority of certain races has all too often been misused to justify a certain historical record. Even today a half-breed is considered to be a white in Brazil and a black in the United States of America. The science of anthropology, which has already amply demonstrated that there is no connection between race and the degree of intelligence, has found on the other hand that such a connection does sometimes exist between race and social class. One may well ask when the historical primacy of culture over biology, which has been evident since MBN emerged, will finally prevail in thinking on this subject. 269. Methodology and African Prehistory. Glossary to Chapter 10. Allele either of a pair of genes. Selection differential reproduction of genotypes from one generation to another. Gene migration crossing over of reproducing individuals from their original population to an adopted population crossbreeding, regarded by racialists as deleterious for the superior race, in fact in this context represents an enrichment of the human gene pool. It is thus a positive factor in biological terms, though it may give rise to social problems. Genetic drift, a change in the composition of the genetic heritage which occurs by chance in a small and isolated human group, resulting in a drop in gene frequency or the disappearance of an allele. Mutation, the appearance of a change in a hereditary characteristic through the modification of one or more genes. Studies undertaken at UNESCO's request as a part of the General History of Africa Project, J. Hiernes, Rapport sur le concept de race, Paris, 1974. J. P. Reitmeyer, Comments on Race and Population History in Africa, NEW York, 1974. E. Sproudle, Problems of Study of Human Races, Prague, 1976. 270. Migrations and Ethnic and Linguistic Differentiations. BOLDEROGGE. Historians were long convinced that the peoples of Africa had never had any history of their own, nor any evolution that was peculiarly theirs. Everything in the nature of a cultural achievement was thought to have been brought to them from elsewhere, by waves of immigrants coming from Asia. Such convictions are reflected in the works of many 19th-century European scholars. They were systematized and crystallized in the form of doctrine in the works of German ethnographers handling with writing at that period. At that time, Germany was the main center of Africanist studies. Shortly after Africa had been divided up by the great colonial and imperialist powers, works describing the life and customs of the peoples of the colonized countries began to make their appearance in England, France and Germany. It was in Germany that the potential of the scientific study of the African languages was first recognized. The year 1907 saw the establishment in Hamburg of the Colonial Institute, which subsequently became a great center of scientific research and was responsible for the publication of the most important theoretical works of the German School of African Studies. Germany was far in advance of the other colonial powers in this field, for in England it was not until 1917 that the School of Oriental Studies began to teach African languages, whilst in France, at that time, the École des langues orientales vivantes paid little attention to them. It was only in 1947 that the School of Oriental Studies in London was renamed the School of Oriental and African Studies. In France, too, the systematic teaching of these languages was not introduced until slightly later. The theories of the German school and recent discoveries, all this explains why Germany played a predominant role in research into the history, ethnography and languages of Africa in the period immediately preceding the First World War, and also why work which appeared in England, France and Belgium was based on the theories of German scholars. Thus Western European ethnographers continued to maintain, at the beginning of the 20th century, the view propagated by German scholars that the peoples of Africa had never had a history of their own, and methodology and African prehistory. These views provided linguists with a basis for what is known as the Hamitic theory, according to which the development of civilization in Africa was influenced by the Hamitic peoples who came from Asia. An examination of these thoughts shows that they all derived from Hegel, who divided the peoples of the world into two kinds: historical peoples, who had contributed to the development of mankind, and non-historical peoples, who had taken no part in the spiritual development of the world. According to Hegel, there was no historical evolution in Africa proper. The destinies of the northern fringes of the continent could be said to be linked to those of Europe. Carthage, being a Phoenician colony, he considered formed part of Asia, and he saw nothing of the African spirit in Egypt. Hegel's ideas exercised a considerable influence over almost all the scientific research done on Africa in the 19th century, in particular on the first attempt at a history of the peoples of Africa by Schwartz. WHO compares the history of the races of Europe to the events of a fine sunny day and that of Africa to a heavy dream which the sleeper, on awakening, soon forgets. It was in Asia, Hegel said, that the light of the spirit dawned and the history of the world began. This was considered to be beyond dispute, and European scholars regarded Asia as the cradle of mankind from which emerged all the peoples who invaded Europe and Africa. It is interesting to know that the English ethnographer Stowe thought it quite certain that the oldest inhabitants of Africa, the San, came from Asia in two separate migratory waves, the first consisting of rock painters, the second of rock engravers, who took another, quite different route. They were said to have crossed the Red Sea by the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait and then traversed the equatorial forests, reaching the southernmost tip of the continent. The footless account of the thesis propounded by the German school, fortified by its historical and cultural basis, regarding the progressive occupation of the African continent by successive waves of immigrants is to be found in the works of the German geographer and traveler, Fr. Stallman. In fact, at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, a vigorous offensive was launched against the doctrine of evolution, which constituted the theoretical basis of the works of R. Taylor, L. H. Morgan, Lubb, and others. The cultural and historical school of thought repudiated the theory of a uniform, overall development of mankind and advanced a diametrically opposed theory, postulating the existence of different cycles of civilization, differentiated by intrinsic elements derived from a mainly material culture. According to these writers, the spread of cultural achievements was due mainly to migrations. The first to put forward this view was the German scholar Leo Frodenus, and Angerman subsequently described the progress of the cycles of civilization across Africa. But it was Stallman who gave the most detailed account of the development of African cultures. He maintained that 272 migrations and ethnic and linguistic differentiations. The original population of Africa consisted of small people, the Pygmies and the San, possessing virtually no elements of culture. Then arrived in migratory waves from Southeast Asia dark-skinned, fuzzy-haired Negro peoples who spread all over the Sudanese savanna and penetrated into the equatorial forest, bringing with them the beginnings of agriculture, the cultivation of bananas and root crops, the use of wood and implements and bows and arrows, and the building of round and square huts. These people spoke isolating languages. They would have been followed by waves of Proto-Hamites, also from Asia, but in this case from regions further north than those which were the homeland of the Negroes. The newcomers spoke agglutinated languages with noun classes and they taught the indigenous peoples of Africa the use of the hoe in agriculture, the cultivation of sorghum and other cereals, the rearing of small horned cattle, and so on. The crossbreeding of the Proto-Hamites with the Negro peoples gave birth to the Bantu peoples. They were followed by invasions of waves of fair-skinned Hamites, coming into Africa, some through the Suez Isthmus and some across the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait. They were said to have been the ancestors of the Fulani, Hausa, Maasai, Bari, Galler and Somali peoples, and also of the Khoi. The latest arrivals brought further elements of culture to Africa, large horned cattle, spears, many uses of leather, shields, and so on. These fair-skinned Hamites, Stallman maintained, came originally from the steppes of Western Asia. They were followed by a wave of Semitic peoples, who provided the basis for the development of the culture of ancient Egypt. They brought with them the cultivation of cereals, the use of the plow and of bronze. They were followed, in Egypt, by the arrival of the Hyksos and the Hebrews and, in the Ethiopian highlands, by that of the Habeshet and the Miri. The last to come were the Arabs, in the 7th century of our era. All these peoples brought with them to Africa new elements of civilization that were quite unknown before their arrival. Stallman's work was published in Hamburg in 1910, not long before the First World War, but his ideas on the gradual building up of African civilization by alien races were developed later by other ethnographers, such as Spamus and Lauschen in Germany, Seligman in England, and Honey in Austria. In linguistics, the Hamitic theory began to emerge parallel with the theories of the cultural historic school. The initiator of this theory, Meinhof, held that the ancestors of the present-day San were the oldest autochthonies of Africa, and that they were a race quite distinct from all others, and speaking languages which had clipped consonants, while the Negroes, considered to be autochthonous in the equatorial and subsaharic zones, spoke tonal and isolating languages with monosyllabic roots. Subsequently Hamitic peoples entered the Sudan from Arabia by way of North Africa. These newcomers spoke inflected languages, they engaged in cattle breeding and, from the cultural point of view, were on a much higher level than the Negroes. Some of the Hamitic invaders, however. 273. Methodology and African prehistory traversed the savannas of East Africa and interbred with the indigenous population to produce the Bantu-speaking peoples. In short, this pattern can be reduced to a fill-in for sequences. At the outset, there were the click languages, and these were followed by the highly rudimentary isolating languages spoken by the Sudanic Negroes. The mixture of these languages with the Hamitic languages produced the Bantu group of languages of the superior agglutinative type. Finally, the languages spoken by the Hamitic conquerors introduced the inflected languages which were eminently superior. The Hamitic theory was upheld by many linguists and spread from Germany throughout Western Europe and beyond. In the period between the two world wars, however, all these theories collapsed. The first blow they suffered came from the discovery of the Australopithecines in 1924 in South Africa. Other discoveries followed and are still constantly being made, not only in the southern part of Africa, but also in North Africa and, more particularly, towards the east, in Tanzania, Kenya and Ethiopia. All these discoveries combine to show, without any possibility of error, that the development of man in all his racial variety took place in Africa. Thus, any theories according to which Africa was populated by consecutive waves of immigrants are untenable. The celebrated paleoanthropologist, Abdias, so rightly points out, Africa is the only continent where there is evidence, an unbroken chronological sequence, of all the stages in the development of man. In fact, specimens of the Australopithecine age, Pithecanthropoid man, Neanderthal man and Homo sapiens succeeded one another, each with their implements, from the most distant eras right through to the Neolithic age. This bears out Darwin's theory that the remote ancestors of man lived on the African continent. Furthermore, these discoveries proved that it would be totally wrong to deny their endogenous cultural development. In this respect, the rock paintings and petroglyphs in the Atlas Mountains, in southern Africa and in the Sahara provide striking evidence with far-reaching implications. There is no longer the faintest shadow of doubt about the great depth of the cultural archaeological evidence, since relative chronology based on the form and treatment of objects and their stratigraphical position has now been supplemented by absolute dating based on such scientific methods as carbon-14 and potassium-argon. The picture of the pattern of the cultural evolution of the African peoples has been completely transformed. For instance, it has been found that the Neolithic era in Saharan and Sahelyan latitudes dates back much further than had been thought. This discovery completely alters the relationship between cultural development in Africa and in the Mediterranean world and, in particular, the Near East. The remains discovered in Tassili Najjar and also at Taggart Okakus in the borderland between Algeria and Libya are quite conclusive. The examination of hearts and ceramics discovered here shows that the people 274 migrations and ethnic and linguistic differentiations were already using pottery from 8000 before our era onwards. At Okakus, the Negroid-type skeleton bearing traces of skin clothing was discovered. The materials examined date to 9000 before our era. A similar date applies to remains discovered in the Hagar Mountains, which were subjected to analysis in 3 separate laboratories. From these findings we may conclude that the Neolithic age in Tassili Najjar and Anati is apparently older than the Neolithic age in the countries of the Maghreb and is contemporary with that of southern Europe and Cyrenaica. So of particular significance are the results of research done on organic remains found in Neolithic camps in Lower Nubia. From the results obtained it has been possible to draw the conclusion that people already gathered and prepared grain from wild cereals in the 13th millennium before our era. Radiocarbon tests on the remains found in the Bilanga district having indicated the date 12,050 ±280. The same method of examination applied to remains from the Tuska region gives the date 12,550 ±490. This proves that the gathering of grain from wild cereals was practiced in the Nile Valley 4,000 years earlier than in the Near East. According to a firmly entrenched historical tradition, any account of the history of Africa should start with Egypt. Today, However, there are good grounds for revising this view. The American Egyptologist Breasted, who wrote in the early years of this century, described the area made up of Egypt, Palestine and Mesopotamia as the Fertile Crescent, and indeed this zone formed the kind of crescent in which the pharaonic civilization took shape and the city-states of Sumer and Akkad developed. But these date back only to the 6th or 5th millennium before our era, whereas, much earlier than that, the existence of climatic conditions suitable to the development of stock raising and rudimentary agriculture throughout the whole of the area lying between the valley of the Indus and the Atlantic Ocean had favored the emergence of a primitive form of class society and state. Thus, the Fertile Crescent represents only a terminal development in a large region teeming with life where, little by little, MBN grew familiar with wild cereals and began to cultivate them, and also began to domesticate large horned cattle, sheep and goats. Proof of all this is furnished by the study of rock paintings in the Sahara and by radiocarbon dating, together with the analysis of fossil pollens, etc. We may expect that some chronological schema may subsequently be made more precise. However, the theory about the peopling of Africa from Asia is already completely discredited. Instead, Africa must be recognized as the center from which men and techniques were disseminated in one of the key periods in the development of mankind, the earliest Stone Age. In later eras we find evidence of the reversal of this trend with migratory currents flowing back to the continent of Africa. 275. Methodology and African Prehistory. Anthropological and linguistic problems. Comparison of the information furnished by the anthropological, linguistic and cultural research done on the ancient history of Africa shows that anthropology certainly provides the most important and the most reliable data. Anthropological characteristics persist for a very long time, whereas languages undergo rapid changes, sometimes in the course of a few generations, as we see when the people emigrates to another linguistic area or when it is invaded by conquerors speaking a different language. So we see that the black population of North America has retained its original anthropological type unchanged by climatic and geographical conditions very different from those in their continent of origin, but that its language and culture do not now differ from those of the white population of the United States. The only traces of its ancient African cultural and spiritual background remain in songs, music, dances and religious beliefs. The parallel case is that of the Sedai, descended from the Africans who were taken to India centuries ago from the east coast of Africa. As late as at the beginning of the 19th century these people still retained their own language, but they now speak the languages of the Hindu people amongst whom they live, Gujarati, Urdu and others, so that all that remains to indicate their African origin is their physical type. In both these cases, the language the Africans took with them to a foreign land was lost in the course of a generation or two. The history of the languages spoken by the aboriginal inhabitants of North Africa may also be cited. After the conquest of the countries of the Maghreb by the Arabs, and more particularly after the invasion by Arab tribes in the 11th century, the population of the countries of North Africa became Arab so far as language and civilization are concerned. Their original languages survive only in parts of Morocco, and in Kabylia, Jebel Nafus and the Oases. According to the anthropologists, however, the main characteristics of the original physical type have remained unchanged, which shows that anthropological features, while subject to the influence of the biotope on the physical character, are more stable than language or culture. It may be stated on the data at present available that, on the whole, the distribution of modern racial types throughout Africa reproduced the ancient pattern of the major anthropological groups which are sometimes rather hastily termed races. The various types of the Mediterranean race have been represented in North Africa since a very distant era. East Africa was inhabited by peoples of an Ethiopoid type, as confirmed by the finds of paleoanthropologists in Kenya, and the whole of the extreme southern part of the continent by Sem groups. The tropical and equatorial forests formerly occupied a much larger area than at present, and it was probably there that the Pygmies appeared. They were a separate race whose physical type developed into special. 276. Migrations and ethnic and linguistic differentiations. Environment of an extremely humid climate and the virtual absence of light in the forest. The Negroid race, called Suganic or Congolese, developed to meet the conditions of tropical latitudes, in West Africa in particular. Probably because the acidity of tropical soils is not favorable to the preservation of fossils, few skeletal remains have been found for identification and dating. Nonetheless, after the first discoveries made during the excavations at Assalar, negroid-type skeletons of various, sometimes extremely ancient, periods have been found not only in the Sahara, but also in southern Nigeria, which probably indicates that it was here that this particular human type evolved. The problem of the early peopling of the Sahara has been keenly disputed, but it is quite clear from a study of the rock paintings that a black population predominated in this area, although other types can also be detected, such as the groups with Afro-Mediterranean features which were also early inhabitants. In Egypt, documents and monuments dating back to the Old Kingdom refer to Libyan peoples with fair skin and blue eyes, and also to darker-skinned Timbuktu peoples. Greek historical sources, too, speak of fair-skinned Ethiopians as well as of darker-skinned more southerly Ethiopians. It seems therefore that the ancient population of Libya was made up of different races. Thus we find one Romban author saying that some of the Libyans resemble Ethiopians, whilst others are of Cretan stock. The ethnical composition of the population of the Nile Valley seems to have been very complex. As the Sahara dried up, its peoples retreated towards the humidity of the valley. The Ethiopoid and the Afro-Mediterranean groups mingled with Negro groups of the Sudanic type. The same kind of intermingling probably took place in all the flowholocustron basins adjoining the desert, such as the lower Senegal, the middle Niger and Lake Chad. Since, as has already been stressed, the anthropological profile displays remarkable constancy, often over many thousands of years, it might not be entirely wrong to project some of the main features of the present-day ethnic pattern backwards into prehistory. In any event, the race is formed from the interaction of a great variety of factors, progressively creating different inherited characteristics but also transmitting these different characteristics through heredity. These characteristics derive from the need of a people to adapt itself to its environment, to the conditions of sunlight, temperature, vegetation cover, humidity, and so on. As a general rule, which is naturally subject to many exceptions, anthropologists suppose that the forest African is rather small in stature and light-skinned, whereas the African of the savanna and the Sahel is taller, lean and slim, and darker-skinned. However, things should never be viewed from only one angle, since many factors are at work simultaneously. For instance, the migration of groups bearing different genetic heritages immediately brought two possible sources of mutation into play. The first was the change of biotopes, and the second the meeting of different groups. Scriptris Physiognomici, ed. R. Forster, 1893, Volume I, 389. 277. Methodology and African Prehistory. With the possibility of cross-breeding. Whenever the remarkable somatic resemblance is observed between two ethnic groups that are very remote from each other in space, such as that existing between the Dinka along the upper reaches of the Nile and the Wolof of Senegal, who look alike because they are both dark-skinned and tall, the fact that they live at the same latitude may provide the clue to a perfectly adequate explanation. However, the combination of factors brought into play by the actual march of history should always be borne in mind. In this regard, the highly controversial case of the Pygmies and the San deserves to be studied in greater detail. In the past, it was assumed that there was a racial link between the Pygmies of Africa and those of southern Asia, but the theory now appears to have been discarded. There seems to be every reason for believing that these peoples are the outcome of the adaptation of a certain physical type to its environment, and that this process took place over a very long period of isolation. At the present time, Pygmies are to be found in the forests of Cameroon, Gabon, some parts of the Central African Republic, Zaire and Rwanda. It seems certain, however, that in the past they inhabited a much larger area. The oral traditions of some of the peoples of Western Africa contain references to groups of dwarfs who lived in the forest before the arrival of people of taller stature. The legends of some peoples of Western Europe speak of gnomes versed in the working of metals and living in the mountains. African traditions about dwarfish peoples are, however, to be taken more seriously in view of the fact that we possess historical evidence indicating the existence in the past of pygmies in regions where no trace of them can be found today. The earliest mention of pygmies is found in Egypt in inscriptions dating from the 6th dynasty of the Old Kingdom. Inscribed on the walls of the tomb of Herkhut III at Aswan is the text of a letter from the pharaoh Peti XI in which the young king thanks him for bringing him, as a present, the dwarf named Dep, the word found in the modern languages of Ethiopia. For instance, in Amharic and its various dialects, and also in the languages Tigrinya, Galar, Kombatak and others in the forms Deng, Tank, Dinki, Dongku, Dinka. For the letter states that a similar dwarf had been brought 100 years earlier to the Pharaoh ICC, that is to say, during the 5th dynasty. In this connection it is worth recalling the report of an English traveller who spoke of the presence of dwarfs called Doko in some regions of southern Ethiopia. There is thus evidence that, in the past, there were dwarfs living in what is now the Republic of the Sudan and in present-day Ethiopia. The pygmies living in the equatorial forest were gradually supplanted by incoming peoples of tall stature speaking Bantu languages. The pygmies were driven into the densest and most distant parts of the forests of 2. Cf. J. Hiernes, 1970, Volume I, pages 53 and 55. 3. The exact transliteration of this name is Hrm Wifar Herzog, 1938, page 93. 4. W. Luflau, 1963, page 57. 278. Migrations and ethnic and linguistic differentiations. The Erie and the Ueli, as recounted in the Ansong Alinj, the epic cycle of the Mongo dealing with the peopling of the valley of the Zaire. Similar legends exist also amongst other Bantu-speaking peoples. Thus the isolated groups of pygmies which NOW exist can be considered as the surviving enclaves that prove the existence of a more extensive population which once inhabited the equatorial and tropical forests of Africa. The San are another very specific group living in the continent of Africa. They are of small stature, with copper-colored or yellowish skin, and their hair grows in tufts. In anthropological studies, they are still put together with the Khoi in a Khoisan race. This no doubt comes by extrapolation from the linguistic classification which places the languages of the San and the Khoi in a single family characterized by the use of phonemic clicks. The HE term Khoisan, suggested by Shapra and NOW adopted in many works, is a combination of two Khoi words, Khoi meaning hem and San, the root SA of which means to gather edible plants, pull up roots, collect fruits, and also to capture small animals. The human group is accordingly styled by its way of life, its mode of production. In point of fact, however, the San and the Khoi have very few common characteristics. Account may be taken of the light color of their skin, and also the presence of click consonants in both their languages. It should be recalled, however, that this is not a specific characteristic. Such clicks exist also in the southeastern Bantu languages, such as Zulu, Xhosa, Sotho, Swazi. Examination of the anthropological features of these two groups shows, however, that Khoi and San differ in many respects. For instance, in stature, the Khoi being distinctly taller than the San. They differ also in regard to cranial characteristics, 5 type of hair, and steatopygia, which is very common among the women, whereas the presence of epicanthus is specific to the San. Furthermore, the Khoi and San languages differ as regards both grammatical structure and vocabulary. E. O. J. Westphal, a leading specialist in this field, showed that pronouns, the oldest and most stable part of speech, have remarkably highly developed forms in the Khoi languages. They have 2 genders and 3 numbers, singular, dual and plural. There are inclusive and exclusive forms, whereas in the San languages nothing similar exists. 6. There are therefore not sufficient grounds for classifying the San and Khoi languages in one group. As to the culture of these peoples, they differ in every way. This was, moreover, noted by the first travelers who visited southern Africa in the 17th century, such as Peter Gauld. The Khoi lived in kraals, worked metals and raised cattle, whereas the San lived by hunting and gathering and had no fixed dwellings. Thus, neither anthropologists nor linguists can provide sufficient grounds for assuming the existence of a Khoisan group consisting of Khoi and San. 5. In regard to craniological differences between the two groups, cf. K. Alexis, 1973. 6. B. O. J. Westphal, 1962. 279. Methodology and African prehistory. These two groups of peoples have completely different histories. the San are certainly the remnants of the original population of the extreme south of the African continent. They are now confined to the inhospitable and waterless regions of Namibia and the Kalahari. Isolated clusters of them are to be found also in Angola. In former times, they inhabited the savannas of southern and East Africa as far as the borders of Kenya. As the toponymy and hydronymy of these regions bear witness, the local names of rivers and mountains being borrowed from the languages of the San. The he-click-sounding consonants which are characteristic of the San languages have been borrowed by several Bantu languages. Finally, the rock paintings of the high veld of southern Africa show scenes of armed combat between short, light-skinned San and tall, dark-skinned warriors whose ethnic origin can easily be discerned from the shape of the shields they carry. The small ethnic group, the Hadzabe, living in the region of Lake Eyasi in Tanzania, is a further indication of the extent of former San settlement throughout Africa. The He language of the Hadzabe has not yet been studied in sufficient detail, but there are grounds for thinking that it is related to those of the San. Sometimes support for the thesis that the San once occupied a much larger area than they do today is sought in the presence of round stones, pierced in the center, throughout East Africa. These ring-shaped stones, called wood by the San, were used for weighting a stick for digging up edible roots. However, it is not proved that this technique was diffused by the San group. Thus, for instance, among the Gala in southern Ethiopia and in the region of Hori men dig the soil with long stakes called dongar, and these stakes are almost always fitted with such ring-shaped stones. The same device is used to weight the pestle for crushing tobacco. Thus it is not possible to uphold the view that the San formerly wandered everywhere where ring-shaped stones of the wood type are found. The earliest population of southern Africa should not, however, be considered solely in terms of the pygmies in the forests and the San in the savannas. Other peoples may have existed alongside these. There is, for instance, the fairly recent discovery in Angola of the Pode group, which closely resembles the San in its style of life and probably also in language. At the beginning of the 20th century, Vidar studied the Otabi, who are the remnants of former groups. These people are of small stature and live by hunting and gathering. Unlike the San, they have a very dark skin and thick lips. The He name by which they call themselves is Enu, Koin, which means black people, as opposed to the Khoi, Whom they called red people. An extremely interesting feature of this group is their system of counting. It differs sharply from the system used by the Khoi, Who count in tens. Groups such as these, which probably exist also in other areas, throw precious light on the very complex problem of the earliest peoples of the forests and savannas of Central and Southern Africa. The complexity of the problem is illustrated in the vocabulary and 280. Migrations and ethnic and linguistic differentiations. Phonetics of the Bantu languages, for example, when the presence of click sounds indicates very early contacts between ethnic groups. It follows that discrepancies exist between Bantu languages sometimes to the extent of differences in the word root structure, as in the case of the Dazaning group in the northwest of the Bantu language area. These differences can only be the result of the influence of a pre-existing linguistic substratum. The Pygmies and the San, Who have been considered above, today constitute numerically minute groups compared with the predominant Negro groups and even with the Afro-Mediterranean race of North Africa. The linguistic map of Africa today does not coincide with that of the distribution of racial types, though it may have done so in the remote past. But as the early ethnic groups multiplied, migrated and crossbred over a long period, the development of languages and the formation of racial types no longer coincided in time. By the process of forming racial types is meant the genetic heritage and gradual adaptation to the environment. At present there is no longer any correlation between racial and linguistic distribution. This is particularly evident in the peoples of the Sudan, a convergence zone for two different types of language families. North Africa, including Mauritania and Ethiopia, belongs to the vast Hamato-Semitic area of languages. This is an inapposite term in that it suggests that the languages of this family fall into two groups, Semitic and Hamitic. In the 19th century, indeed, linguists considered that this linguistic family was composed, on the one hand of the Semitic languages spoken in the Near East, and on the other hand, the Hamitic languages spoken in Africa. But the French Semitist and linguist M. Cohen stated quite rightly that there were no grounds for dividing these languages into two groups. In fact, It is now generally agreed that the languages of this family fall into 5 groups: Semitic, Cushitic, Berber, 7 Ancient Egyptian, 8 and the Chat language group. Hence the languages of this great linguistic family are spoken by several races, both Semitic and Black. In the extreme south of the African continent, the San languages, to which the quasi-languages of Angola and Habzapi in Tanzania have to be added, would seem to belong to a specific group possessing the 2 general characteristics of the presence of click sounds and an isolating type of structure. The wisest course would perhaps therefore be to classify these languages as Paleo-African, in the same way as the term Paleo-Asian is used for the languages of the peripheral regions of Northeast Asia. The Khoi languages, whose grammatical structure is different, should not be included in this group. The Khoi were cattle breeders 7. According to some authors, Berber forms part of the Semitic group. 8. In the view of some African Egyptologists, Ancient Egyptian is one of the African Negro languages. 281. Methodology and African prehistory. Who came south with their herds from Northeast Africa and settled in the midst of San indigenous population? Some groups of San adopted the Khoi language, for instance, the ethnic groups found in the Otavi Mountains. It is quite possible that this is also the history of the San central nucleus, especially the Naran. The view that this route may indeed have been taken by the Khoi as they spread from the upper reaches of the Nile in the north across the savannas of East Africa is supported by the existence, not far from Lake Eyasi, in Tanzania, of the small Sandal group whose language appears to be related to the Khoi languages. The history of the Khoi is, generally speaking, one of the most puzzling problems in the ethnic evolution of Africa. In this connection it may be noted that Westphal thought it possible that the click sounds in the Khoi languages might have been taken from the San languages. This would seem to be an interesting theory, but so far no evidence has been produced in its support. Then no doubt the savannas of East Africa were the first part of the continent to be inhabited by human beings. This region is inhabited today by peoples of Negro race speaking Bantu languages, but they were preceded by San and Khoi groups, whose survivors are the Sandal and the Habzapi. Other peoples in the same region speak Cushitic languages or languages belonging to other linguistic families, Iraq for instance. These languages are those of peoples who lived in these parts before the arrival of the speakers of Bantu languages. Some of Whom made their appearance in comparatively recent times. Between the zone of the Semito-Hamitic languages spoken in the north and the zone of the Paleo-African languages which are spoken in the south of the continent, there is a vast zone inhabited by peoples speaking languages that De La Fosse called Negro-African languages, Meinhof and Westermann called Suganic and Bantu, and which Greenberg now calls languages of the Congo-Kordofanian and Nilo-Saharan families. As early as 1963, I recognized the unity of these languages, proposing that they be called the Zinj languages. Within this general category linguistic families or groups could have been distinguished, by further research. The term Negro-African languages is unsatisfactory. The first part of the term seems to confuse the concepts of race and language. Black inhabitants of the Americas, and sometimes even of parts of Africa itself, speak totally different languages. The second part of this term, African, is also inappropriate because all the languages spoken by the inhabitants of Africa, including Afrikaans, are African languages. Furthermore, the division of the Negro-African languages into 2 major groupings, Suvonic and Bantu, also appears to be an error, for Westermann's work shows that the languages of the Western Sudan, as regards both structure and vocabulary, have many features in common with the Bantu languages. It was his work which prepared the way for 282 migrations and ethnic and linguistic differentiations. General revision of the classification of African languages which the German School of Linguists had launched in so unfortunate a manner. The classification proposed by Greenberg is based on the method of mass comparison. Whilst taking account of the basic features of grammatical structure, he concentrates attention mainly on vocabulary. By applying this method, in 1954 Greenberg distinguished 16 linguistic families and then narrowed these DOWM to 12. This number was again subsequently reduced in 1963 to only 4. So rapid a reduction in the number of language families is sufficient indication that the method has not been adequately refined. and it also suggests excessive haste to produce a classification at all costs. The four families retained by Greenberg, the Afro-Asiatic group is, in fact, none other than the Semito-Hamitic family. As for the so-called click language family, later called Khoisan, this comprises the languages of the San and Khoi peoples. As has already been stated, this combination is mistaken. In addition to the Niger-Congo family, to which Greenberg later added the Kordofan languages, he distinguishes a fourth group formed by the Nilo-Saharan languages, but their structure has so far been very little studied. In 1972 Edgar Gregerson, using Greenberg's method, came to the conclusion that all languages of both families constituted but a single language family, for which he proposed the name Congo-Saharan. This opinion is in line with M.Y. own proposal to bring all these languages together under the heading of the Zinj group. This group is characterized by the use of varying tones and noun classes, as opposed to the Semito-Hamitic or Eritrean languages with their specific accentuation and grammatical gender. It is not impossible that further studies will reveal the specific character of particular languages or groups of languages within the Zinj or Congo-Saharan family, but this already displays the same type of coherence as does, for instance, the Indo-European family. Within the Great Zinj family, the Bantu languages undoubtedly display a significant homogeneity, as shown by the research of Bleek, Meinhof and Guthrie. The MOMG the subgroups detected by Westermann in the Sudanic linguistic groups, MENDE is quite clearly that with the most positive identity. The West and the East of Amande group are the languages which Westermann called the West Atlantic and the Gore languages respectively. However, the West Atlantic languages are not as homogeneous as Amande languages. Thus British linguists have seen within the West Atlantic languages a distinct group which they called the Mel languages. In point of fact, this extreme western region of Africa was a place of refuge where successive waves of small peoples were telescoped together under pressure from newcomers. So many of these languages still retain traits characteristic of the Bantu languages, the most striking case being that of Bilan. The earlier hypothesis that the Gore languages constituted a single unit. 283. Methodology and African prehistory has been disproved by the work of Manassi, an eminent authority in this field. The presence in these languages of noun classes formed in a great variety of ways by the use of prefixes, suffixes and even affixes, is an indication of the ethnic complexity of the area, which has served as a refuge for many of the so-called Paleo-Nigritic groups, who may be found in mountain areas throughout the Sudan from Senegal to Kordofan. The theory was that they were remnants of the oldest autochthonous inhabitants of the Sudan. This reasoning seems, however, to be entirely without foundation. The composition of this mosaic of groups who have been crowded together in these inhospitable areas is extremely varied as regards both language and physical type. The Sudanese chronicles report on some of these events, thus showing that the process involved was not of very ancient origin. Hence, linguistic fragmentation in Africa has to be linked primarily to historical causes which triggered off waves of migration. So if all the languages of Africa, those of the eastern Sudan appear to have received the least attention, the these Sudanese languages, the Nilotic languages form a separate group, or perhaps even a linguistic family, that is to say, a family of genetically related languages developed over a long period of isolation. The extreme complexity of the ethnic and linguistic composition of the peoples of the eastern Sudan is shown in the remarkable work of the English linguists A. Brighton and A. N. Tucker, who devised a very interesting method for differentiating languages on the basis of the significance of a few characteristic linguistic features. This led to the division of the languages of the eastern Sudan into two groups, the T/K and the N/K languages. The the linguistic groups of this great Congo-Saharan family, the Bantu languages display so striking a genetic relationship that this must be regarded as being a relatively recent phenomenon. So if all the Zinj language groups, only the Bantu languages form a well-established unit. They undoubtedly constitute a genetically related family. The problem of elucidating the Bantu genesis is one to which not only linguists but also historians and archaeologists are devoting considerable research. But there are a number of theories. Some consider that the Bantu-speaking peoples came from the north and, more precisely, from the Cameroon region or, in the case of those WHO think they came from a wider area, the Chad Basin. The migration is presumed to have skirted the forest to the north, so as to outflank it on the east side, and then to have passed through East Africa to spread into southern Africa. Other scholars, like H. Johnston, believe that the Bantu came directly from the Central African region through the Zaire forest. Lastly, some scholars, in line with the theories of the linguist Malcolm Guthrie, who situate the prototype linguistic core of the Bantu among the Luba and Amba on the Upper Zaire, visualize their original homeland as being in that region. Going even further, the Bantu-speaking peoples are even presented as being a biological and cultural unit, overlooking the point that the term 284 migrations and ethnic and linguistic differentiations. Bantu has only a linguistic reference. However, some archaeologists link the spread of the use of iron in the southern part of the continent with the migration of the Bantu, who are presumed to have brought with them a superior technology. However, when the Portuguese landed on the island of Fernando Po, they found that the population spoke Bai, the Bantu language, but knew nothing about the use of iron. This mistake of confusing languages and lifestyles or modes of production had already been made by the ethnographers. WHO conceived of Hamite as involving the unity of race, language and civilization. And historical development is being traced. It is most important not to set about trying to find pure types. It must be remembered that the people speaking Bantu languages vary greatly in their anthropological features, the color of their skin, their height, their physical build, and so on. The Bantu-speaking people living in the forests have different somatic characteristics from the peoples living in the savanna. There are also great variations in the patrilineal domestic economy and social structure. Some Bantu speakers are matrilineal, while others have a patrilineal system. Some use masks and form secret societies, others have nothing of the sort. The only thing all these peoples have in common is a similar language structure based on noun classes, the class indices having always a similar phonetic structure derived from a common base. In the savanna of the Sudan, there were apparently groups of peoples who lived side by side for a long time and who spoke languages with noun classes in which differences in tonality played an important part. As the Sahara dried up, these peoples withdrew to moister areas, to the mountains to the north, the valley of the Nile to the east, and the great Paleo-Chad Lake. These groups of hunters and cattle breeders drove out the indigenous groups, who were forced to withdraw towards the south, either into the forest or round it to the east. These migrations were not necessarily connected with the beginning of the diffusion of ironworking, but it is certain that the knowledge of metallurgy possessed by some of the newcomers gave them the advantage over other peoples. It so happens that copper deposits and ancient workings are located in the same region as that identified by Guthrie as being the nuclear Bantu area, where the Luba and Amba languages contain the greatest percentage of words belonging to a common Bantu vocabulary. The swift development of copper production was bound to be an incentive for the subsequent expansion of the civilization. The greater the distance from the nucleus, the less pure the Bantu linguistic type became, for, as they moved away from the center, the Bantu speakers mixed increasingly with peoples speaking other languages. This particular case shows us that the concepts of language, anthropological type and civilization must never be confused, but that, in the gradual settlement of the continent by many kinds of population movement, the 285 methodology and African prehistory mode of production presumably often acted as a principal vector of linguistic expansion and even for the predominance of particular biological features. 286. Plate II. Moroccan Hoaki, Photo Plate 1.2 Algerian woman and baby a richer photo, Gint. Plate I 1.3 Hertine woman from Idols, Algeria a photo, note. 287. Plate 1.4 Fulani woman from near Gadoua, Plate 1.5 Fulani woman Darkite Sutre Bule, Cameroon Hoaki photo mare. Plate 1.6 Sarakol woman, Mauritania Plate 1.7 Chief, Nomad, Archaïs, Mauritania Some Inca group from the river Aria Binantet. Plate I 1.8 Young Fulani girl from Mali a photo, no. Plate 1.9 Voltayan a photo, no. Plate IIO Germasong Hadi woman, from Plate T.II Wareg child, from Agades, Balera, Niger Binantet. 289. Plate 1.12 Fulani woman, Bor Road, Tawa, Niger Binontet. Plate II-14 Zulu Woman Bay Road Lard, Musée de l'Homme. Plate 11. 13 TWA Pygmy, Rwanda Binontet. Plate 11. 15 Pygmy from the Congo Press, Danny E, Musée de l'Homme. 290. Plate 11.16 Sen Group F Balsan Foto, Musée de l'Homme. 291. African Linguistic Classification. J. H. Greenberg. The nature and purposes of linguistic classification. Like any other set of entities, languages can be classified in an indefinitely large number of ways. One particular method, however, commonly called genetic classification, has certain unique and important characteristics so that when the term classification is employed without further specification in relation to language, it is this type of classification which is meant. It will, accordingly, form the basis for the detailed classification to be set forth in later sections of this chapter. The genetic classification takes the form of sets of hierarchical units with the same logical organization as a biological classification into species, genera, families, and so on, in which the members of the set at each level are included in those of a higher level. It could in fact be set forth in the form of a genealogical tree. For languages to have an immediate common ancestor in such a tree means that they are all the later differentiated continuations of what were once dialects of the same language. We may illustrate this by the well-known example of Indo-European. Since Indo-European has not yet been shown to belong to any higher grouping, this will be our highest level. The Indo-European family is divided into a number of branches, for example, Germanic, Celtic, Slavic, Indo-Iranian and others. This is another way of saying that the original Indo-European speech community eventually divided into a certain number of dialects, Germanic, Celtic, and so on. In turn Germanic, for example, split into three dialects, Gothic, West Germanic and Scandinavian. These Gothic is extinct but known from earlier records, while West Germanic differentiated into Anglo-Frisian, LOW German and High German. Each of these constitutes a group of present-day local dialects, some of which have become the basis of standard languages. For example, German a High German dialect, Dutch a LOW German dialect and English an Anglo-Frisian dialect. The importance of such classifications is that they reflect the actual history of ethnic differentiation in respect to language. Secondly, they form the basis for the application of the methods of comparative linguistics by African linguistic classification, means of which MUCH of the linguistic history of individual groupings can be reconstructed. Finally, such knowledge of linguistic history provides the essential basis for inferences regarding the non-linguistic cultural history of the groups concerned. The history of African linguistic classification. It is obvious that without an adequate accumulation of empirical data regarding the languages of Africa, it would not be possible to undertake a comprehensive classification of the languages of the continent. Even minimal satisfaction of this requirement was not present until the earlier part of the 19th century. However, even previous to this period, certain observations relevant to classification had been made, based on an accumulation of data that began essentially in the 17th century when the first grammars and dictionaries of African languages began to appear. For example, Louis Moriano, early in the 17th century, noted that the Malagasy language was very similar to Malay, which proves in an almost certain manner that the first inhabitants came from the ports of Malacca. At a similarly early period, several Portuguese investigators noted the similarity between the languages of Mozambique on the east coast of Africa and Angola and the Congo on the west, thus foreshadowing the notion of a Bantu family of languages covering most of the southern third of the continent. Another example are the descriptions of Jiddisch and Amharic by Job Adolphus in the 17th century, who showed that these Ethiopian languages were related to Hebrew, Aramaic and Arabic. The 18th century saw only very modest additions to our knowledge of African languages, but towards the end of that period we find that the basic concept of genetic classification begins to come into clearer focus in the form of specific hypotheses regarding the existence of certain language families. It was such hypotheses that formed the basis in the 19th century of the development of linguistics as a comparative historical science. Works on the history of linguistics commonly cite a statement by William Jones in 1786 to the effect that the relationship of Indo-European languages was the decisive event in regard to these developments. That such ideas were in the air can be seen from the fact that 5 years earlier Martin had, with at least equal clarity, enunciated a similar hypothesis in regard to the 1. For more detailed information on the history of African linguistics cc. M. Doe and D. T. Cole, 1961, D. T. Cole, 1971. There are occasional words from African languages in the works of medieval authors. For these cm. Delafos, 1912-14, pages 281-8, and c. Meinhof, 1919-20. 2. Relation du voyage D-Day Couverture de l'île Saint-Laurent dans l'année 1613-14, a Portuguese manuscript published in French translation in A. and G. Grandier, 1903-20, page 22. 293. Methodology and African Prehistory. Malayo-Polynesian languages and likewise hierarchy for the Finno-Ugric languages. These developments were accompanied by a virtual mania for collecting comparative materials on large numbers of languages. The earliest of these was the Glossarium Comparativum Linguarum Tochius Orbis of 1787 sponsored by Catherine the Great of Russia, which included data from 30 African languages in the revised edition of 1791. The early 19th century was marked by a great acceleration in the production of grammars and dictionaries of African languages as well as the publication of comparative word lists of considerable numbers of African languages such as those of Killam 1841, Norris 1841 and Clark 1843. 3. By far the most important of these in its extent, systematic organization and consistency of phonetic symbolization was the classic Polyglotta Africana compiled in Freetown, Sierra Leone by S. W. Cole. For this accumulation of data in the first part of the 19th century was paralleled by the first attempts at overall classification, for example, by Belby and in successive editions of Pritchard's Inquiry into the Physical History of Mankind. 5. In spite of differences in details, certain generally accepted conclusions emerged during the first half of the 19th century. Some of these have stood the test of subsequent research, while in other instances they at least raised the fundamental questions to which subsequent classifiers had to address themselves. The results which had thus been attained by I-860 are widely summarized as follows. 1. The term Semitic, introduced by Schweizer in 1781, was already understood in approximately its present form. 6. The existence of an Ethiopian branch of this family was well established, including Jidda's classical Ethiopic and such modern languages as Amharic and Tigrinya. 2. The resemblances and probable relationships of certain other languages to Semitic were already noted. These included ancient Egyptian, Berber and the Cushitic languages. These latter are spoken mainly in Ethiopia and Somalia. Hausa in West Africa was by some included in this category. These languages were sometimes called Sub-Semitic. The name Hamitic was proposed by Renai in 185 s. 7-3. In southern Africa Liechtenstein is credited with making the first clear distinction between the Khoi and San languages on the